So now we know how to create text. Let's talk about styling the text to make it look the way that we want it to look. As you know, when you click on a particular text object, the control panel updates to show you the settings for that text. But since we're going to get deep into the actual settings for the characters here, I am going to go to the window menu, choose Type, and open up the character panel. This way we can focus on all these settings right here. It's important to note that when you have the character panel open, if you click on the flyout menu here, there's something here called Show Options, and that gives us a whole lot more settings here. So let's take a look at what we have available to us for styling characters. Now, I'm also going to share with you a couple of tips and tricks as well as we start working with text, just to make it a little bit easier to do so. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my type tool here, just switch to my regular type tool, and highlight my text here. By the way, the text that you have highlighted is what gets changed. So here, if I were to make a change now, let's say to the point size, for example, let's go a little bit smaller, that only happens to that word that's selected. I'm going to press undo. I'm going to select everything here. By the way, you don't need to select your text with the type tool. You could, of course, use the arrow tool, but I'm doing this because I'm going to show you that we'll apply certain settings just to certain characters on its own. First of all, the basic settings. If I go to the character panel, I have basically the font family. When I go ahead and I scroll down the list over here, you can see that the fonts actually appear in the typeface so that you get a better idea of what they look like. Doesn't really work out that well for typefaces that are actually more on the graphical side than they are on the typographical side. For example, if we go to Zap Dingbats and things like that, you'll see that there's just a whole bunch of little icons here. So unfortunately, that would be a little bit more difficult to see. But there are ways to turn that off. The most important thing I think of all these is that if you look at the far left, you'll see that there are different icons here. There's like a TT and an O. In some cases, you have a red A. That just identifies the different types of fonts that are being used. For example, red A's are PostScript Type 1 fonts. The green O's are OpenType fonts. And the TTs are TrueType fonts. And when we get into more detail later on in this video title, where we talk about advanced text options, we'll learn about the differences between those. But that helps to identify them as well. I'm just going to leave it set to where it is right now. Once you set a family, you can then choose which face specifically. Different typefaces and fonts will have different options that are listed here. You could choose the point size. Then you can also choose here kerning. So by default, kerning is set to auto. If you're not familiar with typography and you don't know what kerning is basically the amount of space that you can either add or remove between the actual characters that appear inside of a text string. Now, we're not talking about adding spaces and so on and so forth because you don't want to have space. A space identifies a new word. So when spell check kicks in, you don't want it to have a new word that way. But if you feel, for example, that, let me go back over here where you see maybe the S, and because of the way that the A is shaped, where it kind of slants upwards and away from the S, it might appear as if there's just too much space between the S and the A. You can come here basically and choose to have a negative value, for example, -5, and see how the A kind of scooches closer towards the S. Just to show you, I'm going to do basically a -50 to make it a little bit more apparent of what's happening. You can see how now there's less space between the S and the A. So that's what kerning does. The keyboard shortcut for kerning is holding down the Option key on your keyboard, or if you're on a Windows machine, hold down the Alt key, and then use the left and right arrows on the keyboard, and that basically goes ahead and adjusts the amount of kerning 20 settings at a time when you go ahead and you do that. We can change it all back here to 0 as well. One thing I just want to point out, if you choose your text over here, there is an option here other than auto, something called optical. Optical is actually a really cool setting. It is a technology that exists inside of Illustrator. It actually came from InDesign's very powerful text engine. The optical setting basically looks at the letter forms and the shapes of the letters based on every font and automatically adjusts it so that there's an even amount of space between each of the characters. So it's actually a really cool setting. I use it often. Think of it as a powerful automatic kerning that does a really good job on that. What's great about optical kerning is that as you change the typeface, the kerning values will update as necessary. And by the way, just pointing out, if I put my cursor now between the S and the A, I see the value -36 that appears in parentheses. So if the value is in parentheses, that means that's a setting that Illustrator defined, not me as a user. So when I did basically choose the optical kerning, Adobe Illustrator decided that based on the way that the characters were set and the font that was used, that it would be best to do a -36 for kerning at that particular point. So again, that's much to it. You can, of course, override it by simply now typing in a new value if you wanted to, but that's the setting that's there. This setting over here is leading. Leading is the amount of space that appears between one line to the next, so the amount of space or the distance between the baselines of each line of text. Now, in this case here, we only have one line of text, so the leading setting won't mean much, but if you have, let's say, paragraph text like I have over here, by adjusting, let's say I select this entire paragraph here, I just triple-clicked on the paragraph to select it. If I increase the leading, you can see that the amount of spacing between each of the lines is increased as well. So that's one thing. There's also, by the way, an auto setting which automatically figures out what the leading or the amount of space between those lines should be. You have the ability to use the scaling options. You can either horizontally or vertically scale your text if you wanted to do that. I don't suggest it unless you really need to squash text for a certain way. And by the way, a manual way to do that would just simply to stretch it this way if you wanted to. Not much of a difference in how that works. Baseline shift is useful for many different things. You basically have the ability to select any character and then adjust the baseline shift either above the baseline or beneath the baseline. And that could be helpful when you're having superscripts or subscripts, so on and so forth, many different types of type treatments that you could use. There's also a cool little feature inside of Illustrator that allows you to rotate a single character within a text string. It's useful sometimes when you want to have something sideways. I can't imagine something just being arbitrarily rotated, but one thing that's readily apparent when you use this setting is that you need to really think about the kerning of how the other letters play into that when that happens. Illustrator also has an underline feature as well, and a really cool feature here, which I'll point out before we kind of close out on working with the character settings, is the language setting. So I could actually specify that this particular text is a certain language. Illustrator's spell check feature is actually multilingual. So what I could do is I could run a single spell check, and if I told Illustrator, hey, this text is Spanish, it'll actually spell check this word in Spanish. So that's really great, though, because you can actually select an individual word in a paragraph and say to Illustrator that word is a different language. So if you're doing, let's say, a children's book and casa means house, you can actually highlight the word casa and change that to Spanish, and then when you run a spell check, you don't get a spell check error on the word casa because it's spell checking the word casa in Spanish, but everything else in English.